Picture this: July 1946. You are sitting in a Budapest cafe, and the waiter hands you a bill for a single cup of coffee. The price? 400 octillion pengo. That is a 4 followed by 29 zeros. You hand over a massive bundle of freshly printed banknotes. But before the waiter can walk back to the register, the inflation rate literally doubles. Your money lost half its value in 15 hours. This is not an exaggeration. This is the recorded financial history of Hungary, and this exact mathematical destruction has repeated across multiple continents. Look at Yugoslavia in January 1994. The daily inflation rate hit 65%. Prices for basic survival goods were doubling every 34 hours. Look at Russia in 1998. The government defaulted on its domestic debt. It and the ruble lost 70% of its value against the dollar in 6 months. Here is the absolute reality that most retail investors completely ignore. Fiat currency failure is not a black swan event. It is a historical certainty. The average lifespan of an unbacked fiat currency is roughly 27 years. The global monetary system has been unanchored since the 1970s. Do the math. So here is the only question that matters for your portfolio. When the fundamental rules of money collapse overnight, what actually retains its purchasing power? I have analyzed a century of economic autopsies, from Hungary to Yugoslavia, Russia to Argentina, and extracted the hard financial forensics. This is not speculation. This is market data. By the end of this analysis, you will know exactly which 5 assets survived total economic ruin. And you will clearly see which heavily leveraged assets went to absolute zero. But first, you must understand the predictable pattern of a currency collapse. It is mathematical. Stage 1. The state runs massive, unserviceable deficits. Stage 2. The central bank monetizes that debt by printing fresh liquidity. Stage 3. The purchasing power of the currency noticeably drops. Stage 4. The public realizes the trap and initiates massive capital flight. Stage 5. Complete systemic failure. Yugoslavia's dinar went from a stable medium of exchange to being swept into the street like garbage in a matter of months. Argentina's peso suffered a mathematically identical fate in 1989, experiencing a 3,000% annual inflation rate that devastated the middle class. Same pattern, same stages, same brutal outcome. So, what survived the financial forensics? Number 1 is the ultimate historical anchor: precious metals, gold and silver. These are the specific assets that desperate governments absolutely cannot print, and central banks cannot digitally debase. Here is the brutal math from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. If you held paper rubles in a state bank, you were mathematically wiped out. A lifetime of savings could suddenly buy you a single loaf of bread. But if you held physical gold, your purchasing power was entirely protected. An ounce of gold bought the exact same amount of energy, food, and labor before the Soviet collapse, during the chaos, and after the dust settled. The regime fell. The borders were redrawn, the currency was completely replaced, but the physical gold did not change its mathematical value. Yes, we saw the exact same pattern during the 1998 Russian financial crisis. When the government defaulted on its bonds, those holding gold were completely insulated. Here is what modern portfolio theorists fundamentally miss about gold. Gold does not need quarterly earnings. It does not require a CEO or a board of directors. Its entire mathematical function is to simply not be debased. When the supply of fiat currency geometrically explodes, gold becomes more valuable by default. During the massive inflation spike of the late 1970s in the United States, gold surged over 400% in a matter of 3 years. The mechanism is brutally simple, yet heavily misunderstood. Precious metals are insurance against total monetary system failure. They are not a speculative trade. So you allocate capital to them because they do absolutely nothing except preserve your stored labor when the surrounding financial matrix burns to the ground. Number 2. Foreign hard currencies. When your domestic fiat is entering terminal decline, the immediate escape valve is holding a stable external unit of account. Let me take you to Buenos Aires, Argentina, in the year 2001. You are an engineer. You have 50,000 pesos sitting in a seemingly safe bank account. The Argentine peso had been strictly pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar for a decade. It offered the complete psychological illusion of absolute stability. Then the government ran out of reserves. The mathematical peg violently snapped. The banking system froze your accounts in what was known as the corralito. When the accounts were finally unfrozen, your money was forcibly converted and severely devalued. Your $50,000 in purchasing power vanished overnight. You lost over 70% of your wealth in a matter of weeks, while the nominal numbers printed on your bank statement remained exactly the same. But here's the forensic kicker. A colleague who kept her savings entirely in physical US dollars, hidden completely outside the banking sector, lost absolutely nothing. Not because the US dollar is magically immune to inflation, but because she strategically held a currency that was not actively collapsing at that exact moment. This specific survival pattern repeats everywhere. Ecuador experienced such severe currency destruction in 1999 that the entire population organically dollarized the economy. Yet the citizens simply abandoned the sucre and started trading exclusively in dollars long before the government was forced to make it the official policy. In modern Argentina, real estate is strictly priced and sold in physical US dollars. It is not a policy choice. It is a biological survival mechanism. Access to a stable foreign currency during a localized sovereign crisis is complete, undeniable protection. It is the literal difference between survival and annihilation. The third asset class is deeply counterintuitive. It is the reason amateur investors are wiped out, while institutional money survives. I am talking about productive equities. A stock is not a piece of paper. It is a fractional legal claim on physical, producing infrastructure. It is real factories, heavy equipment, and global supply chains. Let us examine the United States during the Great Inflation of the 1970s. In 1971, the U.S. officially severed the dollar's final link to physical gold. The mathematical consequence was immediate. By 1974, and again in 1979, U.S. inflation violently spiked into double digits. The purchasing power of the dollar plummeted. The broader stock market stagnated in real terms, but specific sectors thrived. Companies that owned hard assets, energy producers, mining conglomerates, and heavy industrials survived the chaos. As the U.S. dollar geometrically expanded, it simply took more of those devalued dollars to equal the true underlying value of that massive physical infrastructure. Their revenues scaled mathematically with inflation. We saw the exact same forensic pattern in Great Britain during the severe sterling crisis of 1976. The UK, a former global empire, experienced an inflation rate of 24% in a single year. They were forced to beg the IMF for a humiliating bailout. Cash savings in the British pound were mathematically decimated, but British equities representing real, global export infrastructure completely preserved their investors' purchasing power. By holding equity in export-oriented conglomerates, you are effectively shorting the failing domestic currency while holding a highly productive, cash-flowing real asset. The fourth surviving asset class operates entirely on the microeconomic level of human survival: consumables, and tactical barter goods. Look at the financial autopsies of the United States during the Great Depression. In March 1933, the government declared a national bank holiday. Every bank in America was forcibly closed. Millions of citizens suddenly had zero access to their cash. The digital and paper economy completely froze. The American heartland immediately reverted to biological value. Coal, preserved food, basic medical supplies, and ammunition became the absolute microcurrency of the working class. Or examine Great Britain immediately following World War II. The formal economy was completely shattered, and rigid government rationing lasted until 1954. Because the British pound was heavily restricted, a massive black market organically formed. Nylon, coffee, chocolate, and fuel became the highly divisible standardized units of wealth. When the formal banking sector is offline, complex financial instruments have zero utility. You cannot eat an options contract. You cannot heat your home with a treasury bond. Consumables are tactical. And you cannot build long-term generational wealth on aspirin, but you absolutely need them to survive the acute, chaotic phase of a systemic crisis. The fifth surviving asset is the ultimate biological bank account: agricultural land. It is the immobile store of value that produces the one thing humans cannot live without. Return to the forensic data of the American Great Depression. The contrast between urban dependency and rural survival was stark and mathematically undeniable. In major American cities, formerly wealthy stockbrokers and businessmen stood in soup lines. Their paper equity had evaporated into absolute zero. But in the American Midwest, debt-free farmers continued to produce raw, life-sustaining calories. They did not have cash, but they had absolute food security. Land cannot be printed by the Federal Reserve. It cannot be digitally debased. It responds exclusively to human labor, heavy iron tools, and natural seasons. Now, we must examine the mathematical autopsies of what goes to absolute zero. Understanding what burns is exactly as important as knowing what survives. The first asset that systematically destroys wealth: fixed income securities denominated in the collapsing currency, government bonds, and treasury notes. Let us look at United States Treasury bonds during the massive inflation spikes of the 1970s. This is the ultimate trap for the conservative investor. If you held a 30-year U.S. Treasury bond in 1970 yielding 5%, you were mathematically destroyed by the end of the decade. By 1980, U.S. inflation was over 14%. Your supposedly safe government bond guaranteed a massive, locked-in loss of real purchasing power every single year. You were loaning hard, valuable money to the government, and they were legally paying you back in debased, hollow, increasingly worthless paper. In financial forensics, we call this return-free risk. Being an unsecured creditor to a heavily indebted state is the absolute fastest route to generational ruin. Look at the very founding of the United States. The Continental Dollar, issued during the American Revolution, is a perfect mathematical case study. The Continental Congress printed the currency into absolute oblivion to fund the war effort without raising taxes. The supply expanded infinitely. It lost 99.9% of its value. The phrase "not worth a continental" became a permanent part of the American lexicon. The first U.S. fiat was a total wipeout. As the second asset that goes to absolute zero, cash savings held within the domestic banking system. You are holding the unbacked liability of a failing institution. You do not need to look at hyperinflation in emerging markets to see this. Look at the slow, deliberate mathematical bleed of the United States dollar. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the U.S. dollar has officially lost over 96% of its real purchasing power. A century ago, a $20 bill bought a solid, 1-ounce gold coin. Today, that exact same physical gold coin costs thousands of dollars. The math is completely undeniable. Sitting in fiat cash is not a neutral, safe position. It is an active decision to be slowly, predictably impoverished. See, you are watching your stored labor geometrically evaporate to secretly fund the astronomical $34 trillion United States national debt. The rules of the global economic order are rapidly fracturing. The American empire is currently displaying the exact same late-stage debt metrics as Rome and Weimar. Consider the third asset that systematically goes to absolute zero: unfunded pension liabilities, and long-term state promises. In the United States, this is a mathematical ticking time bomb. Millions of American workers are relying entirely on a financial promise that is mathematically impossible to fulfill without massive, hyperinflationary money printing by the federal government. When the system mathematically breaks, those promised payouts will either be nominally defaulted on or paid out in completely worthless, severely devalued dollars. The purchasing power goes to zero. The fourth trap is centralized, speculative digital assets that lack actual, fundamental utility. This is the modern American equivalent of the 1630s Dutch tulip mania. Look at the financial autopsies of the late 1990s. The U.S. dot-com bubble saw trillions of dollars flow into internet companies with zero earnings and zero physical infrastructure. When the artificial liquidity dried up in the year 2000, those speculative digital valuations went to absolute zero. The retail investors who held the bag were mathematically decimated. Today, we see mathematically identical patterns in unbacked digital tokens and over-leveraged tech valuations. If an asset requires a constant influx of new fiat to maintain its price, it is a structural Ponzi. When the global credit markets violently freeze, as they did in 2008, anything lacking fundamental intrinsic physical value evaporates instantly into the dark. The U.S. housing market crash of 2008 proved that even seemingly solid assets go to zero if they are built entirely on a foundation of fraudulent, highly leveraged debt. Wall Street financial engineers had repackaged toxic subprime American mortgages into AAA-rated securities. It was a mathematical illusion of safety, designed exclusively to extract wealth. When the underlying subprime loans defaulted, the entire highly leveraged derivative market collapsed. The artificial paper wealth burned, leaving only the brutal physical reality behind. The Federal Reserve's response to 2008 was to print trillions of fiat dollars, bailing out the banks and transferring the toxic debt directly onto the American taxpayer. This is the ultimate, verifiable stage of empire decline, the aggressive privatization of massive financial gains, and the strict socialization of catastrophic financial losses. The United States is not immune to the laws of mathematics. No empire in human history has ever successfully printed its way out of a terminal, compounding debt spiral. Look at the historical autopsies of global reserve currencies. The British pound sterling held the exact same dominant global position that the U.S. dollar holds today. But following 2 world wars and massive, unpayable debt accumulation, the pound lost its reserve status. Its global purchasing power mathematically collapsed. The U.S. dollar is currently exhibiting the exact same late-stage forensic markers. The massive geopolitical weaponization of the dollar has forced global central banks to actively seek alternatives. Since 2022, foreign central banks have been dumping U.S. Treasury bonds at a record pace and aggressively repatriating physical gold. They are reading the mathematical writing on the wall. If the most powerful financial institutions on Earth are quietly dumping fiat debt and hoarding physical metal, why are retail investors still stubbornly holding cash? You must rigorously decouple your mind from the illusion of nominal price tags. If your American stock portfolio goes up 20%, but the dollar loses 25%, you are bleeding wealth. True, generational wealth is exclusively about purchasing power. It is about how many hours of human labor, how many barrels of oil, and how many acres of land your assets can physically command. This brings us back to the 5 historically verified survivors: physical gold, foreign hard currency, productive global equities, tactical consumables, and physical agricultural land. These specific assets do not rely on the hollow promises of politicians. They do not require a functioning solvent banking system to mathematically retain their fundamental value. If the American power grid goes completely down, your physical gold is still physical gold. Your deep, fertile soil in the Midwest is still capable of producing life-sustaining calories. If the Federal Reserve prints another $10 trillion, your shares in a globally diversified, heavy industrial exporter will mathematically scale with the massive inflation. History is leaving a very clear, undeniable blueprint. The financial autopsies of the past century all point to the exact same algorithmic, inevitable conclusion. The massive debt supercycle is ending. The artificial liquidity bubble that has defined the last 40 years of the American economy is mathematically popping right now. You cannot stop the algorithmic collapse. It is a necessary, organic forest fire that violently clears out the dead, unproductive brush of highly leveraged, fraudulent capital. But you can absolutely control where your family's stored labor is positioned when the fire finally sweeps through the global financial system. You can choose to be the oblivious retail investor, standing in the breadline holding a stack of completely worthless paper and deleted banking apps. Or you can be the forensic architect, the individual who recognized the mathematical pattern early and quietly moved their capital into hard, unshakable physical reality. The exits are incredibly small, and the passive crowd is unimaginably massive. When the psychological panic finally sets in, it will be mathematically impossible to acquire hard assets. The price of physical gold will disconnect entirely from the manipulated paper spot price. Agricultural land will simply stop being offered for sale in fiat currency. We are in the final, quiet moments before the algorithmic reset. The math is absolute. The historical precedent is verified. The autopsies have been strictly finalized. Paper fortunes will violently burn. Digital illusions will evaporate. The massive, unsecured debts of the American empire will be cleanly wiped out in the brutal courts of mathematical reality. But the iron will remain. The deep soil will remain. The heavy gold will still be gold. The skilled hands will still know exactly how to rebuild from the ashes. Reject the hollow, highly dangerous promises of the financial matrix. Become an immovable, physical object in a world of pure, unchecked fiat chaos. The music is slowing down. The chairs are being aggressively removed from the room. The absolute final accounting is fast approaching right now. Protect your family. Secure your vital independence. Own the real, physical assets that have verifiably survived every single economic collapse in recorded human history. Because when the screens finally go black for good, only the tangible, physical truth will remain standing in the dark. They won't teach you this in school. They won't frame it this clearly on television. But history leaves fingerprints everywhere. If you're the kind of person who notices patterns, subscribe. And tell me, have you started seeing them too? If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.